Now I have enough information to produce all three phases. Let me compile them. Phase 1. Analysis of the original format, broadcast script, YouTube video narration, military analysis channel. Structure, in order. Teaser hook. Putin's 2014 confidence versus Ukraine's current momentum. April 28th. Ovrazhky Iskander strike. Announcement and significance. The drone weapon, FP2 and its concrete penetrating capability. Cost calculus. Cheap drones versus expensive Iskanders. Nuclear dimension. Iskander's deterrence role. May 2nd, follow-up strike on another Iskander group and radars. Campaign logic. Systematic degradation of Crimea's offensive value. The civilian dimension. Russia's Crimean population as a strategic variable. April 30. Kerch Bridge Guard boat strike. Warning shot framing. Sea Baby upgrade. Next phase naval threat. Why a traditional ground assault on Crimea is impossible. Ukraine's non-traditional liberation strategy explained. Black Sea Fleet Campaign recap. Stage 1. Ongoing degradation of Crimean military assets. Stage 2. The Kerch Bridge's evolving role. Logistics lifeline to civilian escape route. Migration figures. 800,000 Russians in Crimea. Strategic synthesis. De-Russification through attrition. March 2026 battlefield achievements. Record casualties. Liberated territory. Closing call to action. Tone and voice. Dramatic, patriotically pro-Ukraine. Urgent, rhetorical. Putin doesn't want to budge. Direct address to Putin for effect. Conversational with military expertise overlay. Pacing. Strong hook, rapid factual build. Emotional escalation. Strategic synthesis. Optimistic close. Classic YouTube military analysis arc. Claims. Map. Hashtag Claim 1. Russia annexed Crimea illegally in 2014. 2 SSO struck Iskander base near Ovrazhky, 40 kilometers east of Simferopol, night of April 2. 83. Site was a former Soviet R-5 missile base. Concrete bunker walls up to 60 centimeters thick. Weapon likely used. FP2 drone by Firepoint. FP2 warhead currently 105 kilograms. Firepoint aims to upgrade FP2 warhead to 150 kg. Iskander missiles cost Russia up to $4 million to launch. Iskander range up to 500 kilometers. 10. Iskander M can carry nuclear warhead. Russia has been using Iskander cluster variant since at least April 2025. 12. May 2nd strikes hit entire tactical Iskander group, plus radar installations in Crimea. April 30th. Ukraine Navy struck FSB patrol boat Sobol and anti-sabotage boat Grachonok in Kerch Strait. Kerch Bridge previously mined with over 1,000 kilograms of TNT in June 2025. 15. Sea Baby drone upgraded in October 2025 to 2,000 kilogram payload. Russia had 32,500 troops stationed in Crimea by 2017. By May 2024, Russia stopped using Kerch Bridge for frontline supply. Up to 800,000 Russians moved to Crimea since 2014. 19. Only 100,000 Ukrainians remain by late 2023. Russia used preferential mortgages and expulsion to achieve Russification. Russia pulled Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. 1/3 of Black Sea Fleet destroyed or disabled. April 18th. Ukraine struck 2 Russian landing vessels in Crimea. April 29th. Ukraine struck MR-10 radar, air defense system, and Crimean oil depot. March 2026. Ukraine inflicted record casualties on Russia. Phase 2. The Clean Script. Ukraine's Crimea campaign, the strategy that could change everything. When Russia illegally seized Crimea back in 2014, Vladimir Putin believed he had pulled off the perfect geopolitical maneuver. The peninsula was his. Ukraine was too weak, too divided, and too poorly armed to take it back. Crimea, Putin calculated, was simply gone, absorbed into Russia forever. More than a decade later, that calculation is looking catastrophically wrong. Ukraine is now more capable than at any previous point in this war. Its drone industry has matured into one of the most innovative military-industrial complexes on the planet. Its special operations forces are executing missions that would have been considered science fiction just a few years ago. And in the final days of April and the opening days of May 2026, Ukraine launched a coordinated, multi-pronged campaign against occupied Crimea that sent a message Putin never expected to receive. The peninsula is no longer safe. Your military assets there are being systematically destroyed, and the clock is ticking. This is the story of what Ukraine actually did, what it means strategically, and why it could be the beginning of the end for Russian control of Crimea. Let's start with the strike that opened this extraordinary week of operations. On the night of April 28, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces announced they had accomplished something that crossed a significant threshold. Their middle-strike drone units had successfully hit a storage facility for Russian Iskander operational tactical missile systems. This wasn't just any storage site. It was a concealed installation that had been deliberately hidden inside a former missile base near the settlement of Ovrazhki, approximately 40 kilometers east of the occupied city of Simferopol. Ukraine's underground resistance movement, operating inside Crimea at enormous personal risk, had been tracking missile launches from this very location for some time. Their intelligence provided the targeting data that made this strike possible. The physical challenge of hitting this target cannot be overstated. These storage shelters were not ordinary military buildings. They were constructed during the Soviet era as hardened bunkers designed to survive a nuclear near-miss. Their concrete walls measure up to 60 centimeters in thickness, nearly 2 feet of reinforced concrete, topped with an additional layer of packed earth. They were built to be impenetrable. For most of this war, they effectively were. Russia had essentially been hiding its Iskander systems inside fortresses that Ukrainian drones could not crack. That changed on April 28th. The drone Ukraine used to crack those bunkers open was almost certainly the FP2, manufactured by the Ukrainian company Firepoint, the same firm behind the Flamingo long-range missile system. The FP2 is what military analysts call a middle-strike drone, designed specifically to bridge the gap between lightweight reconnaissance systems and heavy payload long-range missiles. It carries a warhead currently weighing 105 kilograms, roughly 230 pounds of high explosive force, and it is engineered to penetrate reinforced concrete before detonating. The company is already working on an upgraded variant that will carry an even heavier warhead, pushing destructive capacity closer to 330 pounds. That development should concern Moscow considerably. The financial logic of what happened at Ovrazhki is devastating for Russia. Every Iskander ballistic missile that Russia fires at Ukraine carries a price tag of between $2 and $4 million per launch. These are not cheap weapons. They represent enormous investment by a military-industrial system that is already under severe strain from Western sanctions and the relentless pace of the war. Ukraine, on the other hand, used comparatively inexpensive strike drones to destroy or damage an entire cache of these missiles inside their supposedly impenetrable bunker. That is not just a military victory. It is a statement about the economic logic of this war. Ukraine is finding ways to impose maximum cost on Russia at minimum expense to itself. Every successful strike of this kind shifts the resource balance further in Ukraine's favor. The Iskander missiles that were housed at Ovrazhki represent something beyond their financial value. Russia has relied on these systems as a cornerstone of its terror campaign against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure since the full-scale invasion began. With a range of up to 500 kilometers, Iskanders based in Crimea can reach deep into Ukraine's heartland. Russia has deployed multiple warhead configurations against Ukrainian targets, including a cluster munition variant that it has been deploying since at least the spring of 2025. And crucially, the Iskander M system is nuclear capable. That nuclear capability creates a permanent undercurrent of implied threat, even when Russia has no intention of using such weapons. Every conventional Iskander strike is a reminder that something far worse is theoretically possible. By destroying missiles at the Ovrazhki site, Ukraine has directly reduced Russia's capacity to maintain that implied threat from the occupied peninsula. And Ukraine was not finished. On the night of May 2nd, Ukrainian defense forces executed a follow-up strike that hit an entire tactical group of Iskander missile systems in the settlement of Druzhne in occupied Crimea. Alongside those launchers, Ukrainian forces also struck multiple Russian radar installations on the peninsula, the coastal radar station near the village of Mayak, and the Podlyat early warning radar near Yevpatoria. These radar systems are the eyes and ears that protect Iskander batteries from counterstrikes and allow Russian commanders to track Ukrainian aircraft and drones operating near the peninsula. Destroying them does not just damage individual pieces of equipment, it tears holes in the defensive coverage that allows Russia to use Crimea as a launch platform at all. What we are watching here is not a series of random, opportunistic strikes. It is a deliberate, methodical campaign with a specific objective: to render Crimea militarily useless as an offensive platform for Russia. If Russia cannot reliably launch Iskander strikes from the peninsula, if its radar coverage is riddled with gaps, if its ammunition depots are burning, then the strategic value of holding Crimea diminishes with every passing week. Putin spent years developing Crimea into what he intended to be an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a military fortress from which Russian power could project across the entire Black Sea region and deep into Ukrainian territory. That fortress is being methodically dismantled, one precision strike at a time. But the military dimension is only part of the story. To understand what Ukraine is really doing, you have to understand the human geography of occupied Crimea and how it fits into Ukraine's broader liberation strategy. On the night of April 30th, Ukraine's Navy announced that it had struck 2 Russian vessels operating in the Kerch Strait, the waterway that separates occupied Crimea from the Russian mainland. The vessels hit were the FSB patrol boat Sobol and the anti-sabotage boat Grachonok. These were not minor targets. Both vessels were key components of the security screen protecting the Kerch Bridge, the massive crossing that connects Crimea to Russia's Krasnodar region. The strike resulted in casualties among the Russian crews. Ukraine's Navy made clear in its statement that this was precisely the point: systematically eliminate the protective layer around the bridge itself. The Kerch Bridge has been a target for Ukraine throughout this war, and with good reason. In June 2025, Ukrainian intelligence agents completed a remarkable multi-month covert operation that planted explosives equivalent to 1,100 kilograms of TNT on the bridge's underwater support columns. The explosion that followed severely damaged those supports and temporarily closed the crossing. That attack demonstrated Ukraine's ability to reach deep inside Russia's most fortified infrastructure. The destruction of the guard boats protecting the bridge on April 30th is the logical follow-on. Remove the security layer, and the bridge becomes dramatically more vulnerable to what comes next. And what comes next could be formidable. In October 2025, Ukraine unveiled an upgraded version of its Sea Baby maritime drone, the unmanned surface vessel that has already proven devastatingly effective against Russian naval targets in the Black Sea. The latest iteration carries a payload capacity of 2,000 kilograms, approximately 4,400 pounds, which is roughly double the explosive charge that Ukraine previously used to damage the bridge's underwater foundations. With the guard boats neutralized, the maritime corridor toward the bridge becomes a viable approach path for exactly these kinds of assets. Russia knows this. The Russian civilians living in Crimea know it too, even if they do not yet fully acknowledge it. To understand why that civilian dimension matters so profoundly, you need to appreciate the demographic reality of occupied Crimea. Since Russia's illegal annexation in 2014, Moscow has systematically pursued a policy of population transfer, encouraging, subsidizing, and in some cases effectively coercing the relocation of Russian citizens to the peninsula. By late 2023, analysts estimated that up to 800,000 Russian nationals had moved to Crimea since the annexation. That migration was driven by a combination of preferential mortgage rates, government employment packages, and the deliberate expulsion and pressure applied to Ukrainian residents, of whom roughly 100,000 remained on the peninsula. The Russian citizens who relocated to Crimea did so on the basis of an implicit bargain with Putin. They would help Russify the territory, and he would guarantee their security. That bargain is now in default. Putin cannot protect his own Iskander bases. He cannot protect the radar stations watching the skies above Crimea. He cannot protect the guard boats around his symbolic bridge. Every drone strike, every missile hit, every burning depot sends a message to the 800,000 Russians who made Crimea their home. The protection you were promised is evaporating. The war your government started has arrived at your doorstep. And unlike on the Russian mainland, where strikes occur but are less frequent, in Crimea it is relentless. This is the genius of Ukraine's strategy, and the reason it does not require a single soldier to set foot on the peninsula. A traditional military assault on Crimea faces obstacles that make it essentially impossible under current conditions. Ukraine needs every available fighting unit to hold the line in the east, where Russia launched a spring offensive in Donetsk that is still grinding forward. A ground assault would also face devastating geographic constraints. The Isthmus of Perekop, the 3-mile-wide strip of land connecting Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland, is a natural killing ground where Russian artillery and missiles could slaughter an advancing force with minimal effort. An amphibious operation across the Black Sea faces similar problems. Ukraine's naval strength lies in drones and missiles, not in the transport ships and landing craft required to move thousands of troops across open water under fire. None of those constraints apply to drones. Drones can navigate around air defenses. They can find gaps in radar coverage. They can penetrate concrete bunkers. They can eliminate guard boats in the dead of night. And crucially, they can fly sorties over Crimea week after week, month after month, creating a drumbeat of psychological and military pressure that erodes the credibility of Russian protection. Ukraine's strategy for Crimea has unfolded in two distinct phases. The first was the systematic destruction of the Russian Black Sea Fleet as an effective fighting force. Over the first 2 years of the full-scale war, Ukraine struck Russian warships repeatedly with sea drones and missiles, eventually destroying or disabling roughly a third of the fleet's operational capacity. The losses became so severe that Russia was forced to withdraw its remaining warships from their headquarters in Sevastopol, one of the most strategically significant naval cities in the world, and relocate them to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland, where they are far less effective. The naval fortress that was supposed to dominate the Black Sea is now a shadow of what Russia intended. With the fleet degraded and pushed back, Ukraine moved into the second phase, the sustained and escalating targeting of military infrastructure within Crimea itself. The strikes in late April and early May 2026 are the most dramatic recent examples, but they sit within a much longer pattern. The Iskander bases, the radar networks, the ammunition depots, the air defense systems, the oil infrastructure, all of it has been hit repeatedly. On the night of April 29th alone, Ukrainian drones struck a radar station, an air defense position, and a fuel depot in Crimea. The tempo of these operations has been accelerating as Ukraine's drone manufacturing capacity has grown and as the destruction of Russian air defenses has opened new corridors into the peninsula's airspace. Each successful strike accomplishes two things simultaneously. It degrades a specific military capability, fewer missiles, blinded radar, disrupted logistics, and it sends a message to every Russian citizen living in Crimea that the promise of security made by their government is becoming meaningless. Ukraine is not targeting civilians, but civilians in Crimea cannot help but notice that the military infrastructure surrounding them is being steadily dismantled. The rational response to that observation, for anyone who has an option, is to consider leaving while the Kerch Bridge is still intact and crossable. And that is precisely what the April 30th strike on the guard boats was designed to accelerate. Ukraine is signaling to Crimea's Russian residents, loudly and unmistakably, that the bridge which represents their route home to Russia is becoming increasingly vulnerable. Today, it is the boats guarding it that are destroyed. Tomorrow, it could be the bridge itself. That signal is not a bluff. Ukraine has demonstrated, repeatedly and convincingly, that it has both the will and the capability to strike the bridge. The residents of Crimea who are paying attention understand that the window for an orderly departure may not remain open indefinitely. If that psychological pressure works, if Russian civilians begin to leave Crimea in significant numbers, then the entire political architecture of Putin's annexation begins to collapse from within. The Russification of Crimea was never just about territory. It was about people. Remove the 800,000 Russians, and the demographic transformation Putin engineered over a decade begins to reverse. A Crimea that is being emptied of its imported Russian population is a Crimea that is becoming increasingly difficult to govern, increasingly expensive to defend, and increasingly hard for Moscow to justify holding at any cost. Ukraine's bet is essentially this: maintain pressure on the mainland, inflict unsustainable casualties on Russia's military, force Moscow into a defensive posture, and let the accumulated effects of the Crimean campaign do the rest. If Russia eventually withdraws from Ukraine's recognized territory under military, economic, or diplomatic pressure, or some combination of all three, the degraded military infrastructure of Crimea and the depleted civilian population might mean that reclaiming the peninsula becomes not a bloody amphibious assault, but simply a matter of walking back in as Russian forces and Russian civilians depart. That may seem optimistic, but consider where things stood even recently. In March 2026, Ukraine inflicted record casualties on Russian forces, with verified figures reaching their highest single-month total of the entire war. Ukrainian drone production enabled strikes against more than 150,000 Russian targets in that month alone, a 50% increase from February. Russia, for the first time since the invasion began, was losing more soldiers than it was recruiting. The territorial gains that Russia had been making at enormous human cost were slowing dramatically. Ukraine has demonstrated that it is capable of not just holding ground, but of imposing costs on Russia that the Kremlin cannot sustain indefinitely. The week of strikes we have examined, the Ovrazhki Iskander base on April 28th, the follow-on assault on the Druzhna missile group, and the Crimean radar network on May 2nd, the elimination of the Kerch Bridge guard boats on April 30th, is not an isolated flurry of activity. It is the visible tip of a sustained, intelligent, and evolving campaign to make Crimea ungovernable for Russia. The strikes are military, but the strategy is political. The target is not just Russian hardware, it is Russian confidence. Putin gambled that time was on his side, that he could wait out Ukraine, wait out Western support, wait out the attrition of a grinding war. Ukraine's response has been to make sure that every day of waiting costs Russia more than the day before. In Crimea, that means fewer missiles, blinder radar, emptier bridges, and a population of transplanted Russian civilians confronting the daily reality that the war they were told would never reach them has arrived. The liberation of Crimea will not look like the liberation of a European city in 1945. It may not even look like a military operation in any traditional sense. It may simply look like Russia running out of reasons to stay.